So, you see the title of the class this morning, and this will be more class-like than sermon-like. It'll be, maybe a mixture, so to speak. But we'll have some interaction for you. But I want to, I suppose the first question to ask, before I get to the question, I should say there's most of what we think of when we think of prophecy would be predicting something in the future, right? So what are some, when you think of biblical prophecy, what are some prophecies that you think of that are specifically predicted and specifically fulfilled? Any that come to mind that stand out to you?
There are a lot of them about Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So specifics, I forget where the passages are, but having to do with being numbered with the transgressors, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Born in Bethlehem.
Almost, in a sense. Born in Bethlehem. We're going to look at that one. So Jesus is the Christ is going to be born in Bethlehem. And again, we'll get to that one. Any others you can think of? Yeah.
Just for Christ, you mean, or
Any.
just for Christ, you mean, or
Anything.
there was one in Isaiah where it proclaimed about Cyrus.
Oh yeah. This one. I thought someone would say that one. That one's one of the more famous ones. Also, it's not about Christ, although it is about God's anointed, and but we won't get into that. But so here's Isaiah 45 and verse 1. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. So, again, specifically naming Cyrus, and this is around 700 BC, give or take, and of course, Cyrus isn't going to be around to release the Jews from exile. As a matter of fact, when Isaiah says this, the Jews aren't even in exile yet. So this is said 150 years before it occurs. And of course, as you would expect, non-believers would debate this. There's people who will say, well, then Isaiah must have been written after Cyrus happened. And, we're not going to get into that either. But here is a prophecy that is fulfilled. Britton mentioned, again, that the Christ would be born in Bethlehem, and that is talked about in Matthew. Are there any others you can think of? Yeah. Yep, there's the... Yep, there's the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and the different parts of the statue correspond to different ages, different kingdoms. Daniel also remember that Jeremiah says that Israel is going to be in captivity for 70 years in Babylon. And Daniel knows this prophecy. And if you go to the book of Daniel, I'm not going to look at this right now, but Daniel remembers it and says, hey, I remember Jeremiah said it'd be 70 years. And he starts investigating and saying that must be coming up. And there's a whole other set of prophecies that follow on that. So Jeremiah predicts how long they're going to be in exile, specifically. So this is... It's also the way in Deuteronomy that God says that you're going to test a prophet, right? If you say in your heart, how may we know that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. So How do you know if a prophet is a prophet? Well, if his prediction is true. So prophecy and prediction very much go hand in hand. But what we're going to talk about this morning, I want to suggest to you that there is another way of thinking. Don't often think about, and it's possible we don't really know it or understand it, and I want us to be exposed to that a little bit more. There's a more common way of talking about prophetic fulfillment that does not specific prediction of something that's happening. This way of prophecy is really goes in line with what we've been talking about this week, and that is something that happens in one period is transformed and expanded in one period, is transformed and expanded, and the same type of event happens a second time. But it's not really a prediction, like we would say it's a prediction. So what does all that mean? Well, if that's a little confusing, we're going to spend the rest of the class talking. Before we get into thinking about prophecy specifically, I want us to think about names in the ancient world. Will someone turn to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 26? Genesis 25 and verse 26. I guess I'll call on you to make it easier. I'll just ask you, Steve, if you don't mind reading Genesis 25 and verse 26.
Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. His brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob, and Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them.
Okay. Notice in what Steve read, it says, why is the word so there? What is that indicating?
The meaning of his name.
Yeah. The meaning of his name, right? Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And what does Jacob mean? Do you maybe have a note in your Bible, or maybe you just know? Supplanter, right? Heel grabber. So Jacob is called supplanter, and he's doing that. He's grabbing onto the heel of Esau. He's grabbing onto the heel of Esau as he is born. So obviously, what's going on in the text, there's obviously a word play. Because, of course, when you and I think of the name Jacob, we don't think of supplanter. We just think of, maybe some guy named Jacob, because it's just a name. And this is a name that people might name their children. So it is a name play on words, a play on the circumstance. So imagine that you have a child, and right after giving birth, this child is very hairy. And so you name him Harry. You say, well, why did you name me Harry? Well, because you're a hairy kid. Horrible to do that too. But that's the type of thing that's going on here. Is what Moses is telling us about the name of Jacob, is that, well, his name is appropriate for the circumstances of his birth. The name makes sense for the event that occurred when the child was born, or the circumstances that occurred when the child was born. Okay, so Jacob's name is given there. Let's turn to Testament, because they are naming it. It has a meaning about the circumstance. Yes, Marjorie.
I have read about that back in the Old Testament, that they used to name their kids after something,
Yes.
something that is powerful, whatever, or what they did or whatever.
Yeah, an example of that. So when they thought about naming their children, here's a quote from a scholar that writing about names in the ancient world. He says, "The name was thought to become intertwined with the destiny of the individual to whom it was given. With the destiny of the individual to whom it was given, with at times almost a cause and effect relationship existing. Somehow, it was thought, the person's life and accomplishments would demonstrate in unknown ways the appropriateness of the name that had been given." There's some things about your name that kind of control your destiny, but you don't know exactly how that's going to play out. And so, let's say that you name your kid Harry because he's a hairy child, and then he gets, you find out one of the big events in his life. He gets into a really difficult situation. You say, "Wow, he's in a really hairy situation there." It's like, well, I didn't expect that his name would be so appropriate. Well, that's funny for us. That's how they kind of thought that somehow this name is going to show its appropriateness. Somehow, in a way that I can't say, something is going to make sense of this name. And so it was, again, this kind of cause and almost predestined you to it in one sense. It was kind of the idea. So, when we see this happening with Jacob, so his name, he grabs the heel, and his name. He grabs the heel, and his name is there. Genesis 27, and if someone wants to read verse 36, Kay, would you mind reading Genesis 27:36? Okay, so now he says, is he not rightly named Jacob? Right? He's clearly saying something about his name is appropriate. Okay, so the name for Jacob has to do with the name for heel. So when he's born, grabbing the heel for heel. So when he's born, grabbing the heel, he's not, as we've mentioned the name, supplanter here, but in the circumstances of his birth, he's not doing any supplanting. He's just grabbing a heel, right? And so any supplanting. He's just grabbing a heel, right? And so he is, and we know, written his story, that foreshadows it, but in the circumstances of his birth, he's just grabbing the heel. And so the name Jacob has sound associations in Hebrew with the word heel, and now it has a sound association with the word to cheat or supplant. And because no one is going to name their son cheater. That's on something negative. So in the circumstances of his birth, his parents aren't trying to say, hey, this guy is going to cheat people and be a supplanter. They're not trying to make a prediction. They're just naming him after the circumstances of his birth. But Esau says, well, there's another word that you can give his name. And so no one corrects him here. Esau doesn't say after this to Isaac, the father does not say, oh, no, don't call him cheater. He's named after. We didn't mean for that to be derogatory. We weren't trying to name him cheater. Isaac doesn't go and correct him. Isaac, in the story, says, oh, well, that was an unexpected, appropriate fulfillment of who Jacob expected appropriate fulfillment of who Jacob is the idea here. So, does Jacob become a cheater because of his name? Or does his cheating cause the connection? Well, that's not so, because that's all intertwined. Your name and what you do somehow come together almost in a very, I would say, mystical way, an unknown way to show its appropriateness. And what that means is for them that as a name unfolds its appropriateness in history, and you can only see how someone grows into their name with hindsight. In other words, you're not going to make a prediction about what's going to happen. You're going to look backwards and say, I see how appropriate that was, right? And so that's what we have happening here. Esau sees this situation in which he's cheated, and he says, here's something. Now I see how appropriate his name is. Does this make sense? Okay. Yes.
It's helpful, actually. I always wondered about, the story with Abigail on the name.
Ah.
Like, who would name their kid?
Yeah.
So it was more probably a sound.
Yes. And I'm glad you bring that up. Yes. And I'm glad you bring that up. One of the last examples we're going to look at today maybe I should have done a better job of doing this, but I don't want to get into Hebrew language too much because I'm no expert in that at all. But what you have in the Hebrew language, written down is consonants, right? There's no vowels in the Hebrew language. So let's say you write my name. Let's just say Matt, the short version, right? How would you write that in Hebrew with only consonants? MT version, right? How would you write that in Hebrew with only consonants? MT. Well, if you're reading MT, what vowels might you put in there that would create other words? Mutt, I don't know why that's the first one that came to my mind, but what else? Met, right? Of course, there's a mat, a doormat. You think of another version of the same word. So there's a number of things you could do. Let's say, my parents named me Matthew because, I don't know exactly why they named me Matthew, but they like the name for whatever reason. But let's say that, later on, I do a DNA test and I find out that I've got all sorts of different DNA from different places, and someone says, you're rightly called Mutt, because you've got all sorts of, that's the type of thing, the word play on the consonants that they can do in Hebrew that we often look at word plays and sometimes think they're a stretch, but on words. And part of that consonant system allowed that. So thank you for bringing that up. We'll look at how that happens again later. So it's only when the events happen that you look. I have called this blossoming prophecy as a way to differentiate it from predictive prophecy, specifically predictive prophecy. And I came up with that just because it makes sense to me. It's that's in the bud. It's not fully there, or maybe just a plant in the ground. There's something coming, and if you've never seen it before, you don't know what it's going to turn into, right? But eventually it will fulfill its purpose, and you'll say, "Oh, wow, okay, it's beautiful." And the blossoming stage to names that we see. And so this is an important part to note. The prophet did not know specifically or even generically how his words would play out in history. The prophet is not thinking that out in history. The prophet is not thinking that, oh, this is going to be a prediction of something someday. Now, the prophet is open to that happening. The prophet is open to his words being interpreted in ways that he didn't see, but he's not trying to make any predictions. And that means that his original intent is important here. It's not to make a prediction. Again, he's aware, but he's not looking at it saying, I think this is going to play out this way. He doesn't know how his words come to fruition. So, one quote that I came across, actually just a week or so ago, this is from Faust, a famous German play, and this is actually God speaking in the play to Satan. It's kind of like a Job scenario, but that's not terribly important to our purpose here. He says, "Sees not the gardener, even while buds his tree, both flower and fruit years adorning." And that's just kind of a way of conceiving of this, that there's something budding, and well, in this case, he's saying that the gardener kind of can see it, and I am making the case here that the prophet, how it's going to play out, but it just kind of goes along with our idea here, the metaphor we're using. Okay, so this is, I'm going to suggest to you then, a lot of how Jesus fulfills the story of Israel and the stories of the Old Testament. Jesus fulfills the story of Israel and the stories of the Old Testament. Jesus is sometimes fulfilling a prediction that is specific, and sometimes it's a very different type of a thing. So let's go into Matthew chapter 2. That's what we're going to look at some time here in Matthew chapter 2. Let's see. Britton, would you mind reading Matthew chapter 2, verses 3 through 6?
When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel."
Okay. Well, we've talked about this a little bit, but I'll just ask anyways. Is this a predictive prophecy or I'm just going to use that term, a blossoming prophecy? Maybe that's to him. And this comes from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. We're not going to turn back and read it because it's there in Matthew. It's quoted there. So when Herod wants to know, okay, where's the Messiah going to be, he goes to a specific prophecy about Bethlehem, and it goes directly from A to B. And so Jesus is a fulfillment of a prediction here. Okay. Stacy, would you mind reading verses 14 and 15 of Matthew chapter 2?
So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son."
Okay, so clearly a fulfillment here, to fulfill what the Lord had spoken. Now, Kinsey, could you turn to Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1 through 2? This is the context of Matthew chapter 2 and verse 14. This is the prophecy. Hosea chapter 11. I know that's not one of the easier books to find in the Bible. But I want to look at what Hosea is saying, and then we'll discuss that whenever you get there, Kinsey.
Hosea
Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 through 2. Actually, I have it up here. I could just let you read from. You can read from the screen if you want.
When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols.
Okay, so who is in Hosea? The nation of Israel. Does he have positive things to say? No. I mean, they're sacrificing to the Baals, burning offerings to idols. So he's talking about an entire nation of people. And he's talking about, this is a context of judgment, that I called my son, but, and then we're not going to go again and read all of Hosea 11 here, but this is not a positive situation. The nation here, but this is not a positive situation. The nation of Israel that was called out of Egypt has rebelled against God. Is there any hint of a prediction of the Messiah here? No. You cannot read Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1 and 2 without already knowing the answer. You can't read that and say, oh, this is going to talk about the Christ. Because it's talking about a nation and it's talking negatively. You and I reading Hosea 11 hundreds of years before, it was predicted that Jesus would go down to Egypt. So why is it that Matthew can do this in his gospel? And the answer, I suggest, is because Matthew is not reading the fulfillment as a specific prediction. He is taking the words of Hosea, and looking in hindsight of what he knows of Jesus and saying, oh, Jesus fulfills these words. And so Hosea has no idea that he's making some prediction here. He's not making a prediction here. This isn't even a prediction about Israel. It's actually talking about their past. So there's no prediction going on here. But of course, Hosea would be open, as the prophets would be, to saying, well, somehow these words could take on a different to something that happens in history. And so this, I suggest to you, is very similar to like what we saw with the name of Jacob from Esau. That Jacob's name from Esau, that Jacob's name was not assumed to mean cheater before Esau looked at him and said, hey, your name's appropriate, right? And so the same thing applies here. This is not a prediction. Doesn't mean that there was a specific prediction made. It means that the word is appropriate in a way that is even greater than the first time it was spoken. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Which is why we're talking about this morning. Anthony. Yeah.
And that God did love him and did call him out. And though this goes negative, in the story of Jesus, it only goes positive.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not a one-to-one correspondence there. It's like, well, this is negative about them, but it's not negative about Jesus. So good observation. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16. Do you mind reading that for us? Actually, 16, and then 16 through 18. Matthew 2, 16 through 18. Keep going in 17 and 18, please. That's okay. 18, please. That's okay.
What was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, a voice was heard and loud, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they were grown.
Fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. So this Herod's slaughtering of these children is a fulfillment of a passage. Now let's go back to that passage, Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. I'll just read this here. Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Okay, so Ramah is, well, I'll talk about the context here. In Jeremiah, who remembers what time Jeremiah is prophesying in? Can you tell? Divided kingdom. And as late as it gets, because during Jeremiah's prophecy, Babylon comes and takes them out. Now, in Jeremiah 31, Babylon has not come yet, but it's not very far off. So he is right at the very end of Judah's time as a nation before exile. And what he's talking about in this context is what's going to happen when the Babylonians come. Right? The Babylonians are going to come, and they're going to bring this destruction, and it's going to bring this devastation. And there is, again, nothing in Jeremiah that points us to Jeremiah that is making a prediction that, hey, you know what, in the 1st century A.D., Herod is going to kill children. That's not here in this text at all. Why is that? Why does Matthew say that it's fulfilled? Because in hindsight are fulfilled in this act of Herod. Verse 16, that should say Jeremiah 31:16. Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord. Oh, and I apologize for not showing this verse earlier, because he's very clearly talking about them coming back from exile here, right? The Babylonians are going to come, but keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears. That's not a way of saying don't mourn over experience. But what he's saying is, I'm going to make it right. Like this seems like the end, but if you trust in God, then you're going to see he's going to bring something out of this that is, beyond your comprehension. So, beyond your comprehension. So, the context here is that Babylon has destroyed Jerusalem and people are weeping. And it ends up being a message of hope. And I would suggest that Matthew's quotation of this event in Jesus is kind of another foreshadowing of hope. That Herod has slaughtered these children, and yet, even though Matthew doesn't quote this part of Jeremiah, he has the passage in mind, as the New Testament writers often do when they're quoting the Old Testament. They have a lot of the context that they don't quote. You ever, maybe in your family you have an inside joke, and or maybe you've watched a TV show together, and some event happens, and you just need to say one word to the person with your family or whatever, or you need to say one line from the show, and you remember not just one line from the show, and you remember not just that line, you remember the whole context of that line, right? Well, that's how oftentimes when the New Testament writers are quoting the Old Testament, they're assuming that the readers, when they hear that line, they're like, oh yeah, sorry, I know that ends up being a passage of hope. So they can think, if they're familiar with Jeremiah, then they're going to think, well, this does fulfill in an unexpected way the words of Jeremiah, but it also has this that in that context. And so reading the story of Jesus with that in mind can bring hope as well. Any questions or comments about the things we've been talking about so far? Okay. One more in Matthew chapter 2. Okay. One more in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 23. Linda, would you mind reading that for us? Matthew 2 and verse 23. Okay, so here's another fulfillment. Again, Matthew chapter 2 is all about these fulfillments, that he would be called a Nazarene. Does anyone have a cross-reference in your Bible that shows what passage that's talking about? No? I don't see anyone saying yes. Okay, well, Luke is not going to work. But I'm sure that's a good cross-reference for the birth of Jesus. But we're looking for an Old Testament passage. Judges? Judges? Judges 13:5? I don't know what that says. Oh, it may be about Samson, I guess.
That comes from verse 46, though. Yeah, no, that comes from...
Judges 13 what? 5.
Mine says Judges 13:5.
Okay, Judges 13:5. Look at what that says. Behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God. I didn't look up that passage in this research. But I understand why they reference it. Do you understand why?
Similarity of names between Nazarene and Nazarite.
That's what they're doing. The similarity of Nazarene and Nazarite comes from Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1 through 2. Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 2. Now, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from its roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, fear of the Lord. Anyone see a reference to Nazareth or Nazarene there? You can't. There's a Hebrew word, yeah, it's a trick. Well, it's not a trick question. There is a reference, but it's not one we're necessarily equipped to see in English. The word is branch. The word is branch. Okay? The word in Hebrew is branch. Branch, remember, Hebrew has these consonants, and the word for branch has the consonants NZR. And the word for Nazareth also has NZR. I can't speak to Nazarite also has NZR. I can't speak to Nazarite in Hebrew. I don't know. So I'll leave that open to possibility. Whether it's Nazarite or whether it's branch, that's as close as we get. Either Judges or Isaiah, as close as we get. Either Judges or Isaiah, and even those passages are clearly not saying anything about the Christ being a Nazarene. You will not find anything that says something specific about Nazareth. There are some passages about a light, but nothing about Nazareth. Certainly nothing that's going to take us to Matthew 23 and say, he be called that he would be called a Nazarene. There's nothing that explicitly says that. The only way for this to be a fulfillment is because the word takes on an appropriate meaning. And Matthew and the gospel writers, again, all the New Testament writers looking at prophecy, are saying, oh, I know the story of Jesus, and now I see how it fulfills and brings forward. Now I see how it fulfills and brings forward these words in ways that were unseen even by the people that spoke them before. And that's why he can say, he says it so confidently that he would be called a Nazarene. About that, that's a stretch. But that's because we don't think of language and words the same way that they were thinking of it. And so this is very similar, again, to what's happening to Jacob's name, right? That, well, he's named heel grabber, and then he says, well, it's appropriate that you're a cheater. Well, the connection is only clear in hindsight. And so Jesus is fulfilling this passage that way. Matthew chapter 2 is an easy place to go to show this because it's just happening over. And it's also good because it shows us both prediction prophecy and blossoming prophecy kind of side by side, and it gives us a way to understand how they thought of prophecy. And I hope that as we intended to be necessarily a specific fulfillment every time, they're thinking in ways that are unique to, well, not unique to their culture, but they're strange for our culture. I'll put it that way. But this idea of words and unknown ways is not unique to Hebrew culture either. If you go back and read Greek and other literature, they have similar notions of how words play out in history in kind of mysterious ways that you can't see until it happens. To, again, tie this into our theme, Jesus is the second line of Hebrew poetry. If you weren't here for our Friday night class, we talked about how Hebrew poetry has one line and the second line is parallel to it. And the second line always is said in the first line and expands on it even more. And so when Matthew says he would be called a Nazarene, this is a greater fulfillment of even the original intent of the words, right? And so the second fulfillment of these words, the complete fulfillment of these words is greater than the first. The last becomes first and the first becomes last. So that's how this idea of prophecy ties in. We've got a couple minutes. I guess I won't get into it. I had one other example we could go into, but I really think it would just be too much to get into. Yeah, so I'm not going to. Questions? Yeah, or comments?
Just a thought, I forget which passages in the New Testament prophesied. They didn't really know what they were prophesying about, and they wanted to, but they...
Yes.
It just
Yes.
beyond them to know. And so, not to quibble with some of the words that you've used in talking about this topic, but when prophets made their prophecies, remember those prophecies, they're speaking for God.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, they didn't know what they were speaking. They're speaking for God.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, they didn't know what they were speaking about, and then later on, it would be revealed to one of the New Testament writers, this is a fulfillment of that. The original writer didn't know that, and even the New Testament writer didn't know that until it's revealed to them through the Spirit that it's a fulfillment of that original prophecy that was not clear in any way.
Yeah.
So I guess I just wanted to bring that out, that the writers of Scripture was not always revealed to them what they were writing to be able to understand it themselves. It was
Right.
understood when the proper time came.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to find that passage. It's I want to say it's in Peter.
Second Peter,
2 Peter.
chapter 1, toward the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah.
Mine's on verse 20, no?
No, that's on the right-hand side of the page.
Okay.
Well, verse 20 is, going along with what you're saying, though. Verse 20, but know this, first of all, no prophecy of...
1 Peter 1, verses 10 through 12.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Go ahead.
10 through 12.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Go ahead and read it.
As to the salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you made careful searches and inquiries, seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating, as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you in these things. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you in these things, which now have been announced to you through those who preach the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't know. Now, some of that, some of that's in prediction. There's still a distinction between, there's no notion that, again, like Hosea has any idea there's a prediction in his words, is, I think, the point that I want to make sure we bring out in Hosea, like 11, when he talks about Israel. There's no reason for Hosea to think there's a prediction. And, but these people are directed by God. And so, and that's what gives them the idea that, well, this could be fulfilled. This could play out in a way that I have no idea of. And I think that passage goes along with it. So good thoughts. Well, that'll close our time for this morning. So thanks for your attention and your participation. And we'll pick up the theme again in our sermon.